Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's chapter of our compendium. This is chapter 14, which will cover Reconstruction. And we have Reconstruction set between 1865 and 1885, so it's a 20-year period. And so if you want to follow along, you can on our website, www.tarpeia.us. Tarpeia is spelled Tarpeia.us, and this is chapter 14. So we're now in the latter half of the compendium. There's 26 chapters total, and this chapter is divided into three sections. Each section has its own interactive timeline, like what you see here. And what's on the timeline are a bunch of primary source documents and events that we have added so far. And if you were here last year, I showed you what we had. We have like 5 times the amount of content on these timelines that we did last year, and so I can't imagine how much more content we're gonna have next year when I do these live streams. And so let me just get into this chapter. This chapter begins with the section called Treason Made Odious, which is a quote from Thaddeus Stevens, a Republican leader at this time, leader of Reconstruction. And this section will cover the Andrew Johnson administration. And so let me just read the little description that I wrote at the beginning of the section. You have Andrew Johnson assumes the presidency, determined to restore the Union quickly by appointing provisional governors, arresting prominent Confederate leaders, requiring loyalty oaths, and overseeing the ratification of the 13th Amendment. His lenient Reconstruction and mass pardons for former Confederates allowed Southern Democrats to regain power and enact black codes that reasserted white supremacy and restricted black freedom. Outraged, congressional Republicans asserted federal authority through the Reconstruction Acts, placing the South under military rule and mandating black suffrage and creating the Freedmen's Bureau measures. Let's see. Measures Johnson vetoed only to see them overridden. Contentions culminated in the ratification of the 14th Amendment, redefining citizenship and equal protection, and Johnson's impeachment for violating the Tenure of Office Act, which he narrowly escaped removal. By the time Southern states were readmitted under the Republican terms of the Reconstruction Acts, Reconstruction had been fundamentally transformed from Johnson's plan of reconciliation into a struggle over the meaning of freedom, citizenship, and equal treatment under the law. So Johnson, he swears president in the morning after Abraham Lincoln is killed. That is April 15th, 1865. And I have a message following Lincoln's death by Andrew Johnson. We have the April 18th, 1865 peace agreement. So the Civil War is technically still going on. The South, the Confederacy, has yet to surrender. Robert E. Lee surrendered with the Army of Northern Virginia, but that is not the entire Confederacy. So the Civil War is still going on at this point. You have John Wilkes Booth. He is shot and killed following a 12-day manhunt of John Wilkes Booth for shooting Lincoln. You have General Joseph E. Johnston surrenders to General Sherman near Durham Station, North Carolina. Another major blow to the Confederacy. Johnson's proclamation ending economic restrictions on southern states. So even though the war is still going on, you have the economic restrictions being lifted by Johnson, which kind of shows his leniency towards the South. executive order declaring conspirators in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln to be triable before military commission so that they could be hanged. Proclamation for the arrest of key Confederate leaders. So Johnson is interesting because he will simultaneously be harsh on the South and lenient on the South. One day he will be removing the governors of the former Confederate states and appointing his own governors. The next day he's revoking those governors. One day he's arresting key Confederate leaders. The next day he's pardoning a bunch of them. So Johnson's Reconstruction is all over the place. Here's his executive order rescinding prohibition of arms, ammunition, horses, mules, and livestock to Confederate states. And so again, here's Johnson showing leniency to the Confederacy. Now here's Johnson being strict. He will arrest the Confederate president, Jefferson Davis, and then arrest Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy. During this time, there's this interesting event that happens in Philadelphia called the Octavius Cato's streetcar demonstration, where Octavius Cato sits in a streetcar in Philadelphia and refuses to move when ordered to. This is part of a campaign to desegregate public transportation in Pennsylvania, which will prove successful. Does that sound familiar? It sounds like the 1950s Alabama bus boycott with Rosa Parks. She sits on the bus and doesn't move. It happened about 100 years before Rosa Parks. And so this is why studying history is important. It can teach you about how to be a better activist if you're interested in political activism. You have Grand Review of the Armies, where the Union Army marches in D.C. Again, the war is still going on, but it's kind of a confused time. You have the Third Proclamation of Pardon and Amnesty. The first two were done by Lincoln. These are mass pardons to a bunch of people, Confederates. Proclamation appointing William Holden provisional governor of North Carolina. So during this time, Johnson will appoint provisional governors. And again, it's part of this weird strategy for Johnson where he shows leniency with pardoning and amnesty, and then he shows strictness by establishing his own governors, and then he's going to quickly repeal them in a very short time period. And so you have this one of North Carolina. You have the Eulogy of Abraham Lincoln by Charles Sumner. Proclamation on Abandoned Land. This is to give land back to the Confederates. And so a number of Union generals were taking abandoned former Confederate land and giving it to former slaves who are now free from the Emancipation Proclamation. And now Johnson will be taking that land back from the freed slaves and giving it back to the former Confederates. And so, again, this really mixed Reconstruction. There's literally no plan at this point. You have executive order regarding discharge prisoners of war. So prisoners are being released. Proclamation appointing William L. Sharkey, provisional governor of Mississippi. Removing trade restrictions. Another provisional governor. Here's the Juneteenth order. So if any of you have wondered where the Juneteenth holiday comes from, it comes from this June 19th, 1865 order by General Granger, who is enforcing the Emancipation Proclamation in the state of Texas. Another provisional governor of Alabama, removing trade restrictions. Another provisional, let's see. Yeah, another provisional governor, another governor. I have this interesting letter from letter to my former master by Jordan Anderson. Some people in high school have to read this, and this is a letter by a former slave to his former master, talking about how if the master wants his former slave to work on his property, then the master has to pay the slave for all the years of back pay. So that's a reparations argument. And the Constitution of Alabama, this is post-Civil War. So Alabama, in fact, all of the Confederate states will pass their own Confederate state constitutions. Now that the Confederacy is breaking apart and being reabsorbed back into the Union, the Confederate states will discard their Confederate state constitutions and replace them with pro-Union state constitutions. You have general order to direct the military to provide free transportation for materials required by refugees. Proclamation ending martial law in Kentucky. Johnson's interview on Reconstruction and voting rights. Johnson's statement on race relations. He is not entirely in favor of equal rights between whites and blacks. You have Alexander Stephens. He is released from prison. So he's only been in prison for a couple of months. And he, during that time, will write a little diary. Well, decades later, from this point, all the way around 1910, that diary will be published. And that time period, the early 1900s, around 19 teens, will be crucial for the reemergence of the KKK. And so Alexander Stephens' diary is going to be used for revitalizing the KKK, but also his diary is one of the earliest of the Lost Cause narrative, where in his diary, Alexander Stephens recounts all of his speeches that he gave prior to the Civil War, and he does a complete 180 on the meaning. So when in his cornerstone address, he talks about how the cornerstone of the Confederacy is white supremacy and slavery, and how the Confederate Constitution is the first constitution of the world, which recognizes these two fundamental truths, as the Confederates believed, the truth of white supremacy and the truth of slavery as being a moral good, according to these Confederates. And Alexander Stephens, in his diary, will do a complete 180 and say, oh, no, slavery was a minor issue of the Civil War. It's actually about, states' rights and, economics and finance and tariffs and all these things. And so I think, this is the earliest known document, this diary. And although it wasn't published at this time, it was written at this time. And I think it shows the earliest version of the Lost Cause narrative, which will fuel the reemergence of the KKK 30, 40, 50 years from this point. And so, very interesting time period. Let's see, Johnson's interview with South Carolina delegates on Reconstruction. Johnson still doesn't have a plan for it. Johnson's message to North Carolina, canceling debts. So some states in the South will get get into debt with foreign countries like Britain, and Johnson will say, just ignore those debts, never pay them back. They're canceled. You have the Constitution of Georgia. This is the pro-union constitutions. And now you have the Black Codes. Right now, I think I just have the ones from Mississippi, just a couple of them. And so you have the Apprentice Law, which will force children who are vagabonds to be employed and have to stay employed, and they can't switch their employment. So there's no mobility for employment. And then here's a vagrancy. Vagrants or vagabonds are wanderers, people without employment, people without property, who just wander and maybe they find temporary employment, but they're not living in a place, and they don't have consistent employment. And so there will be a law banning vagrancy, where if you are a vagrant or a vagabond, then you will be arrested and you will be sent to work for free. So basically becoming a slave again as punishment for a crime. Because you have to keep in mind the 13th Amendment, which gets ratified right here, December of 1865, it doesn't fully outlaw slavery. It allows one exception to slavery, which is as a punishment for a crime. And so the South will make a bunch of these new laws, make a bunch more crimes that people could commit and get caught committing. And if it's a black person committing these really ridiculous crimes, then the punishment is going to be slavery. So some people don't, a lot of people don't call it slavery. They call it peonage or some other kind of term. It's literally just slavery, just as a punishment for a crime, which the 13th Amendment allows. This is Andrew Johnson's proclamation revoking the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, except in former Confederate states. So Abraham Lincoln will issue the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus for most parts of the country. Now Johnson is revoking that suspension, basically restoring the writ of habeas corpus in most of the country, except the Confederate States, former Confederate States. Johnson's 1865 State of the Union address. The 13th Amendment gets ratified December 6, 1865. William L. Sharkey to turn over the governorship to Mississippi's elected successor. So now the appointed governors are being replaced by their elected governors in the South. So Johnson's appointment governors was very temporary, only a couple months. Announcement of the successful suppression of rebellion. So this is Johnson announcing the end of the war. You have the first meeting of the KKK, which happens in December of 1865 in Pulaski, Tennessee. Johnson's interview with Frederick Douglass. Douglass will ask him about his plans for Reconstruction. Veto message of the Bureau for Relief of Freedmen and Refugees. So Johnson will veto a bunch of acts from Congress, or bills from Congress, that will be overridden. Johnson's remarks on the end of the Civil War. Johnson's veto of the Civil Rights Act. Johnson proclaims an end to the insurrection in most southern states. Johnson's message to Congress on changing the oath of service. You have the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Despite Johnson vetoing it, this act will be passed anyway. You have the Memphis Massacre, one of the first post-war massacres of the black population by a vengeful southern white population. Thaddeus Stevens will introduce the 14th Amendment in May of 1866. 14th Amendment will pass the House pretty quickly in just 2 days, and then it gets passed through Congress in a month and gets proposed to the states in June. Johnson's veto and passing of the Freedmen's Bureau Act. So Johnson will veto the Freedmen's Bureau Act, but Congress will override it. Johnson's message on the Tennessee re-entering the Union after ratifying the 14th Amendment. So here's another interesting, dynamic of Johnson. He did not believe that states had a right to secede. And so, if a state did not have a right to secede, that means they never did secede. Which means that they don't have to be readmitted back into the Union because they never left the Union. This is one of many arguments that Andrew Johnson will make in favor of the former Confederate states. So Congress will force the former Confederate states to go through this long process, change their state constitutions, appoint new governors, have a bunch of former Confederate soldiers and officers who are disenfranchised from voting or holding office. And, the Congress, the radical Republicans, will force these former states will force the former Confederate states to adopt all these new policies. But Johnson, in order to be readmitted back into the Union, but Johnson does not believe that the states ever seceded from the Union. And if they never left, then they don't have to be readmitted back into the Union. And that the states have the full rights and are equal to all the other states of the Union. Now, this angers the Republicans greatly because they just fought a massive war. They just won the war, and now they're being told by Johnson to treat the states that had just seceded and tried to end our Union, to treat them as equals, as if they never left the Union. You have the New Orleans Massacre, one of many massacres during Reconstruction. You have Johnson proclaims the official end of the Civil War in August of 1866, despite already giving a speech about the end of the Civil War. You have Johnson's Swing Around the Circle speaking tour. And during this tour, he will defend leniency towards ex-Confederate states. He will attack congressional enemies, and he will criticize the 14th Amendment. So, great. Johnson's remarks on readmission requirements for ex-Confederate states. Again, he does not believe that the states had actually seceded, and so they don't have to be readmitted back into the Union. There is violence at some of his speeches. Executive order on potential insurrection in Baltimore. Midterm elections. These are very important. Republicans increase their majority in the House to 76%, and in the Senate to 83%. This weakened Johnson politically in issues especially touching on Reconstruction, foreshadowing his impeachment. Johnson's 1866 State of the Union, Ex parte Milligan. This case held that military tribunals could not try civilians in areas where civilian courts were still operating, even during wartime. The court ruled that such trials were unconstitutional when regular courts were open. You have a Republican, Boutwell, who will propose the first Reconstruction Act. Now, this is the inauguration day of the new Congress. This is the after the midterms. So this is the super duper radical Republican Congress. So on inauguration day of this new Congress, Thaddeus Stevens will give the speech on Reconstruction, which is like a rallying cry for the Republican Party, and he will whip the Republican Party into shape to get a bunch of acts passed Johnson. So Johnson will immediately veto message on black suffrage in D.C. That veto will be overridden, and you'll have an act to allow for suffrage in Washington, D.C. Johnson's veto message on the admission of Colorado, veto message on Nebraska gets overridden. Act to admit Nebraska, that's to readmit Nebraska back into the Union. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's right. Let's see. Proclamation of the admission of Nebraska. Johnson's veto message of the first Reconstruction Act gets overridden. You have the first Reconstruction Act. This is very important. This act laid the foundation for congressional reconstruction by dividing the 10 former Confederate states, all but Tennessee, into 5 military districts, each under a Union general's authority, while each individual state was under a provisional government. Virginia shall constitute the 1st District, North Carolina and South Carolina, the 2nd District, Georgia, Alabama, and Florida, the 3rd District, Mississippi and Arkansas, the 4th District, Louisiana and Texas, the 5th District. It required the drafting of new state constitutions that enfranchised black men, mandated ratification of the 14th Amendment, and barred many former Confederates from political participation as prerequisites for readmission to Congress. So that's a lot just for the first Reconstruction Act. You have Johnson's veto message of the Tenure of Office Act, which gets overridden, and it's this very act that Johnson will be impeached over. Kind of ironic. The Second Reconstruction Act. Oh, excuse me. Oh my goodness. Johnson's veto message of the Second Reconstruction Act gets overridden. Jefferson Davis is released from prison in 1867. Johnson's Southern tour promotes American unity. Johnson's military order on the Reconstruction Acts. Treaty ceding Alaska. Johnson's Northern tour, where he will promote his Reconstruction policies and American unity. Third Reconstruction Act. Johnson will veto that as well. Executive order replacing radical Republicans. Secretary of War Defense. Stanton with General Grant. This will be in violation of the Tenure of Office Act, which is what will lead to Johnson's impeachment. The U.S. will seize the Midway Islands in August of 1867. The Fourth Proclamation of Pardon and Amnesty by Johnson. You have the Constitution of Alabama, Johnson's 1867 State of the Union Address, Johnson's message to Congress defending his replacement of Stanton. Senate rejects Stanton's replacement and reinstates him as Secretary of War. Constitution of Arkansas. Second executive order to replace Secretary Stanton. Stanton barricades himself in his office for 2 months. Johnson is violating the Tenure of Office Act. House will impeach Johnson for violating the Tenure of Office Act. Florida's Constitution. 11 articles of impeachment sent to the Senate. Senate trial of Johnson will begin in March of 1867. While that's going on, you have the Fourth Reconstruction Act that's passed. Johnson's veto message of judicial reform. The RNC will nominate Grant. Johnson is acquitted May of 1868. James Buchanan, the president who was president before Lincoln, he dies. Georgia State Constitution. Johnson's veto of the act to readmit Kansas, saying an act is not necessary. It will be overridden. Readmission of Arkansas, Florida. Johnson vetoes an act to readmit ex-Confederate states. That gets overridden. Readmission of Carolina. Fifth Proclamation of Pardon and Amnesty. DNC will nominate Seymour and will pass their own Democratic Party platform. The 14th Amendment is ratified in July of 1868. You have the readmission of Louisiana, South Carolina, Alabama. Johnson proposes a few amendments. Johnson will veto an act to exclude ex-Confederate states yet to reorganize from the election. That gets overridden. Johnson's veto message of an act relating to the Freedmen's Bureau, that gets overridden. Yeah, the 14th Amendment gets certified on July 28th, 1868. Yeah, the Burlingame Treaty. This treaty is interesting because it allowed for unlimited migration from China to the United States. Pretty interesting. This is before the Chinese Exclusion Act. Thaddeus Stevens dies in 1868, just 1 year after the passage of the first Reconstruction Act. You have the Camilla Massacre. Johnson directs General Grant to regulate the election in the South, which is kind of awkward because he's the one who will be elected. Fort Laramie Treaty. Johnson's 1868 State of the Union. The Sixth Proclamation of Pardon and Amnesty. Speech by John M. Langston, chair of the committee representing the National Convention of the Colored Men of America. Benjamin Wade is removed from the Senate. Wade's Senate term expired and he was not reelected by the Ohio State Legislature. Wade was president pro tempore of the Senate and would have become president had Johnson been removed from office, since Johnson did not appoint a vice president, which means that the president pro tempore of the Senate would be the president. Now we go into the Johnson administration. This section is called Let Us Have Peace. Covers the years 1869 to 1877. So I have a lot, many documents for this one, just like the previous one. So you have Grant's first inaugural address. Virginia is readmitted. Act on State Constitutions. Judiciary Act of 1869. Act granting women property rights in D.C. Have a Supreme Court case, Texas v. White, which determines whether or not states had a right to secede. It will be determined that they did not have the right to secede. You have the first transcontinental railroad. Is the transcontinental railroad line is finished, connecting east to west. Yeah, the proclamation of on the Virginia State Constitution. National Women's Suffrage Association is founded by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth C. Stanton. Proclamation on the 8-hour workday. That is for federal employees. Virginia State Constitution is ratified. Black Friday and the Gold Ring conspiracy. This is the start of a financial crisis regarding gold prices. Franklin Pierce dies of alcoholism. Yikes. We have the Texas Constitution of 1869. Constitution of Mississippi. U.S. v. DeWitt. Grant's 1869 State of the Union Address. Women's Wyoming Suffrage Act. So Wyoming will be one of the first states that will allow women to vote. Standard Oil is incorporated in 1870. Grant transmits his treaty to annex Santo Domingo to the Senate. Readmission of Virginia. 15th Amendment gets passed. Hepburn v. Griswold, 1870. The readmission of Mississippi. Grant's message on annexing Santo Domingo. Grant's announcement of the ratification of the 15th Amendment. Readmission of Texas. Treaty to build the Panama Canal. The First Enforcement Act. The Department of Justice Act, which will establish the, Department of Justice in order to help enforce the Reconstruction policies. Senate rejects the annexation of Santo Domingo. Grant's message to Congress about Latin trade relations. And you have the Tariff of 1870, which will help contribute to the crash of 1873. We have the readmission of Georgia. Georgia will be the last state to be readmitted back into the Union, and this will be the end of Reconstruction as per the Reconstruction Acts, which end when the last state is readmitted back into the Union, which in this case is Georgia. Direct Secretary of War to provide troops to suppress the KKK. Grant's neutrality speech with France and Prussia. So what's going on in Europe is the Franco-Prussian War. That's going on. You have the midterm elections, where Republican majority in the House dropped from 70 to 56%, and then from the Senate from 83 to 75%. So a huge drop of support in Congress. Now that the former Confederate states are readmitted back into the Union. Democrats take back North Carolina state legislature. Oh, excuse me. Grant's 1870 State of the Union address. Grant's message to Congress on racial violence in North Carolina. Some more proclamations. You have the Second Enforcement Act, Indian Appropriation Act, Appropriations Act including civil service, Grant's message refuting corruption claims, Third Enforcement Act. You have the legal tender cases about whether or not it is legal for the federal government to print paper money. It's not backed by anything, fiat currency. Proclamation on the Third Enforcement Act. Speech on Political Corruption in New York by R.B. Roosevelt. Appeal to the people of the state of New York by the Committee of 70. Yeah, the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Proclamation on the Third Enforcement Act and the KKK. Proclamation suspending habeas corpus. Civil service reform. So I think you guys get the idea of how to use this compendium. It's like a slideshow. You can use your mouse or the keyboard, and you can look through each of these if you want. Let's see, William Seward dies. You can see that a lot of the old leadership of the Republican Party die pretty early on in Reconstruction. I mean, Thaddeus Stevens, the guy who will be the leader of the Republican Party for the Reconstruction Acts, he dies as soon as they get passed. And so that's a big issue. You have Charles Sumner. He's still suffering a brain damage from his caning 20 years before. That's still an issue for Sumner. Seward dies. Horace Greeley will die during this election. And so all the key leadership for the Republicans die pretty early on. And that, to me, it does a better job explaining why Reconstruction fails. It's like the people who thought of it, the people who planned it out, die before it can really even be implemented, let alone seen through. Susan B. Anthony will illegally vote. She'll get arrested for it. And she'll ask, is it a crime for a U.S. citizen to vote? Saying that since she is a U.S. citizen, she should be able to vote, despite her being a woman. And the Great Boston Fire. Have to go through and make sure all the images are loading properly. You have the railroad industry, which will crash during this time, during the start of Grant's second inaugural address. The Colfax Massacre, one of many massacres during this time period of black people being killed by white mobs. Slaughterhouse cases, Bradwell versus the states. Chief Justice Chase dies. He gets replaced by Waite, which to me is a terrible, terrible Chief Justice. Almost as bad as Taney. Let's see. Susan B. Anthony will take what she said when she was arrested for illegally voting and turn that into a short book. Executive order on civil service. Start of the Panic of 1873. And the Long Depression. This is the Long Depression, which lasted 2 years longer than the Great Depression. Grant's 1873 State of the Union Address. Representative Elliott, one of the first black men in Congress, will give a speech on the Civil Rights Act. Tompkins Square Park. So you have labor and strike riots going on. The White, he swears in as Chief Justice. Charles Sumner will die. So that's, again, another key Republican leader. Proclamation on disturbances in Louisiana. And the White League. So you have three main domestic terrorist groups. You have the KKK, you have the Red Shirts, and you have the White League. And they're all kind of doing their own thing, but they're also doing pretty much the same thing, which is killing or harassing black people or northerners, carpetbaggers, northerners who move down south. And I'm blanking on the term used for scallywags. That's what it is. The scallywags are the Southerners who sided with the Union and are loyal to the Union. And so the midterms for Grant's second term do not end well for the Republicans. Democrats gain 94 seats, achieving 62% majority. Republicans retained the Senate majority in 1874. So the Democrats pretty early on get a majority of House seats, 62%. The first national convention of the Women's Christian Temperance Movement begins. So you have a lot of the progressive era, Gilded Age type organizations being established. You have violence by the White League in Louisiana. Civil Rights Act of 1875. Enabling Act of the State of Colorado. Whiskey ring scandal, one of many scandals during the Grant administration. Grant's letter to Harry White on renomination for a third term. Ooh. Edgar Thompson Works opens the nation's largest steel mill, owned by Carnegie, begins production in 1875. So this is very much the birth of the Gilded Age, which will actually be the next chapter that I will talk about tomorrow. Even though it begins here, the height of it will be in tomorrow's chapter. See, some more scandals going on during the Grant administration. More scandals. Supreme Court decisions, which will start shooting down Reconstruction policies. Veto message on fixing the presidential salary. Veto message on presidential oversight. 1876 Republican Party platform. You have the Battle of Little Bighorn, also known as Custer's Last Stand. And this is the 7th U.S. Cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer against a coalition of Lakota, Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. Native forces were led in action by war leaders such as Crazy Horse and Calm, and Sitting Bull serving as a key spiritual and political figure who had helped unite resistance against U.S. encroachment following the discovery of gold in the Black Hills. The battle ended in a decisive Native victory and the destruction of Custer's detachment, with about 268 U.S. soldiers killed, including Custer and roughly 210 men under his direct command, while Native casualties were significantly lower, but remain uncertain, likely ranging from several dozen to around 100. Then you have the Democratic Party platform, Constitution of Colorado, Hayes' letter accepting the Republican nomination, the Hamburg Massacre, one of many massacres during the Grant administration, this time by the Red Shirts. Admission of Colorado. Reports of the Senate Special Committee to investigate the 1875 Mississippi election. The election of Hayes, which I made my own timeline just for the election of Hayes, because a lot of people believe in this compromise, but I've done a lot of research and I can show that there was no compromise. And so, just stop believing that. If you're interested in learning more about that, let me know, and I'll see if I can do a video on that. The Senate passes the Electoral Commission Act. Justice Davis elected senator in Illinois. House passes the Electoral Commission Act. Justice Davis recuses himself from the Electoral Commission. This is part of the election of 1876, and a supposed compromise didn't actually happen of 1877. Now we get into the third and final section of this chapter called Southern Redemption, and this covers the administrations of Hayes, Garfield, and Arthur from 1877 to 1885. So we begin with Hayes's inaugural address. Frederick Douglass is appointed U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia. Federal troops withdrawn from occupying South Carolina and also Louisiana. First engagement between U.S. Army and the Nez Perce. Executive order preventing federal employees from participating in political activities. Tour of Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. Great Railroad Strike of 1877 happened. Hayes sends troops to West Virginia during the Great Strike. Hayes sends troops to Maryland, and that will lead to the Reading Massacre. Hayes sends troops to Pennsylvania during the strike. So Hayes has to worry about the Gilded Age of strikes, all while trying to reconcile the failures of Reconstruction. Hayes' 1877 State of the Union. Aaron Sargent introduces the Anthony Amendment, which is the first attempt at women's suffrage. Although it fails, it shows you how early women's suffrage was being seriously considered. President Hayes signs the U.S.-Samoan Treaty, act to allow women to practice before the Supreme Court. Very interesting. Hayes' veto message on the Bland-Allison Act. Army Appropriations Act. Tour of Wisconsin, Minnesota, Illinois, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. About the strike. Hayes' veto message on restricting Chinese immigration. So he will actually veto what would become the Chinese Exclusion Act. End of the Long Depression, which began in 1873, ends in 1879. So that's 6 years of depression. Proclamation warning against unauthorized settlement in the Indian Territory. Hayes' veto message on Army appropriations. Constitution of California. Hayes' veto message on prohibiting military interference in elections. Hayes' veto message on General Appropriations Bill. Hayes will be doing lots of vetoes. This is the patent for the first light bulb in 1880 by Thomas Edison. Republican Party will nominate Garfield. Garfield's acceptance. Here's Hayes on a wagon during his Great Western Tour. Hayes will be the first president to visit the West. The election of 1880 between Garfield and Winfield Scott Hancock. 1880 State of the Union. You have some acts, which are executive orders, I should say, which will ban alcohol use in certain areas in the military, which will contribute to the Prohibition movement. An act to facilitate refunding of national debt. Garfield's inaugural address. The Star Route scandal. Yet another scandal during a Republican presidency. First American chapter of the Red Cross. Garfield gets shot in July of 1881. Tuskegee Normal School established. The Tuskegee, Alabama, Tuskegee, Alabama Institute by Booker T. Washington. Garfield dies on September 19th, 1881. And then Arthur becomes president. Address at the Yorktown Centennial. Address for Arthur in 1881. His State of the Union address. The Senate ratifies the Geneva Convention on War and the treatment of prisoners. You have the Anti-Polygamy Act, which is going to be angering the Mormons. Arthur's veto message of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Proclamation on Law and Order. Then you have the Chinese Exclusion Act, which Arthur vetoed, so that's kind of good. An act to create a tariff commission. Treaty with Korea. Charles Godot is executed. He's the one who shot Garfield. Arthur's veto of the River and Harbor Act. Midterm elections. For these, the Democrats gain a majority in the House, but lose the majority in the Senate. Arthur's 1882 State of the Union. Pendleton Act. Treaty with Mexico on commerce. United States v. Harris. Mongrel tariff. An act on pensions and benefits. Treaty with Mexico on a border. Brooklyn Bridge opens in May of 1883. 12 of the state route scandal found not guilty. It's weird. Issues executive order reducing internal revenue collection districts from 123 to 83. So let's see. Civil rights cases, which will be the Waite Court, saying that the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was unconstitutional. Frederick Douglass will respond to the civil rights cases. The 1883 State of the Union address. Executive order on civil service. Arthur's message to Congress on infrastructure investment. Same thing with improving the Navy. Increasing armaments. Repeal of the Ironclad Oath. Civil government of territorial Alaska. Republican Party platform nominates Blaine over Arthur. And then Bureau of Labor, part of the Department of Labor, is established. Proclamation on prohibition of non-Indian settlement of Oklahoma lands in the Indian Territory. Statute of Liberty. presented in Paris before it makes its way to the United States. Bureau of Navigation established. An act creating Central and South American commissions. Democratic Party platform, which will nominate Cleveland. Blaine's acceptance of 1819 or 1880 State of the Union, or not State of the Union, election. Let's see, Cleveland's letter accepting his nomination. 1884 election. Arthur's 1884 State of the Union address. Arthur's dedication of the Washington Monument. An act making occupation of public land illegal. So now all those vagabonds are now being kicked out of commonly held land, public land. A Contract Labor Act, which will put a lot of them to work. And we end with Arthur Boyd's grant as a retired general with full pension, which helps Grant a lot because he's struggling with money. And this will conclude this chapter on Reconstruction. Again, if you want to look through and read every single one of these primary source documents, you can on our website, www.tarpeia.us. Tarpeia is spelled Tarpeia. And we are an educational nonprofit, a 501c3. So all donations are tax deductible. And if you want to get your name listed below the compendium, just let me know in the donate form when you sponsor an era. And yeah, I hope to get some better rest tonight, and then I hope to see you guys tomorrow. Please leave a comment if you have any questions about history. I'll try to answer it to the best of my ability. So thank you again for watching, and well, have a nice day.